Today, tourists and visitors from all over the world are enchanted by the beautiful Glenveagh National Park in County Donegal. Standing near the impressive old castle with beautiful gardens and surroundings, it is difficult to imagine the area's turbulent past. This all goes back to one John George Adair, who had the castle built in the late 1800s. He soon earned the name Black Jack Adair, having bought about what became known as the Derryveagh Evictions. Wealthy landlords of that period were renowned for their oppression of tenants, but Black Jack proved to be the worst of all. Records show that he became a greedy, land-grabbing blackguard. Born in 1821 in County Laois, where his family managed property for absentee English landlords, land agents, putting their masters' interests first, took to evicting tenant farmers from their property in order to benefit their owners. So Black Jack was to keep up his family's tradition, only in the most evil ways imaginable. He was, by 1860, well on the way to his most dastardly deeds, when he purchased tracts of land in the Derryveagh Mountains and had soon built up a holding of some 15,000 acres, including leases of land for a hunting preserve for his own personal use. He even owned the land at Garton, birthplace of St. Columkill, plus Glenveigh and Derryveagh. He built up the estate and eventually possessed fee farm rights to Derryveagh. This meant he had the right to receive all the rents collected from Derryveagh tenants, but not the ownership of the land or sporting rights for hunting and fowling. The failure to take title to the land and get sporting rights is recorded as having triggered Adair to do his most dastardly deeds. The dreams of a peaceful life of about 150 people in the little community were soon to be wiped out, with no idea what the future was to hold for them. One day, Black Jack began his evil doings by deciding to indulge his favourite sport of fowling on the Derryveagh property that he thought he owned. However, some tenants thought this was a trespass on their land and resisted by beating the bushes, which spoiled his sport, and they surrounded him when he tried to move away. He used his fowling gun to threaten them and left shouting that they would pay dearly. With revenge boiling within him, Adair made it his business to acquire title to all of Derryveagh, so he was in a position to carry out this vicious threat. It was said at the time that when a Scottish land steward in Adair's employ was murdered and nobody was identified as the killer, Black Jack set out to do his worst. The 48 families in the Derryveagh district first became aware that something evil was afoot when in December 1860 Adair announced that he would personally accept their rents. So he informed them, one at a time, that he was rearranging the farm boundaries. This put the fear of God in the tenants, and it proved right that they assumed the worst could happen. St. Patrick's Day 1861, Adair obtained a writ giving him the right to take possession of the land and houses in Derryveagh. Scenes of horror and human misery ensued when Adair and his henchmen, including 200 policemen, arrived first at the house of widow MacAward. Ban MacAward and her daughters were thrown outside, fell to the ground, the wailing and keening to be heard for miles around. The official eviction report says that some 45 houses and 47 families were evicted. 158 children put on the roadside with nothing but the sky for shelter. Babies died, and elderly women who had survived the famine years before were drowned. 250 people in all from neighbouring townlands were left destitute. When all this was done, a deathly silence came over the area. It is possible to experience this eerie feeling to this day, but no local people wish to talk about it. Despite all his land grabbing and evil actions, Adair was not satisfied that his wealth had increased enough. His thoughts were on more fortune seeking, and by 1866 Black Jack Adair had made his way to America, where he increased his fortune in the post-Civil War economic boom there, married a wealthy widow and acquired a large cattle ranch in Texas. Construction on Glenveagh Castle began in 1867, and Black Jack and his wife lived a high life there until he died in St. Louis in 1885. His widow Cordelia spent the next 30 years or so living in luxury at the castle. But what of the Glenveagh area and the Derryveagh Evictions? Well, like many communities, they pulled together as best they could. Neighbours, friends and relatives and some local landlords took in most of the evicted families, and others not so lucky ended up in Letterkenny, Donegal or Dunfanaghy workhouses. Some left the workhouses in time and managed to find shelter in places like Clough-Neely and Creeslough. News of the Derryveagh evictions spread throughout the Irish communities in Australia and America. Those who had settled in Australia after the Great Famine organised an Australian Donegal Relief Fund, and people from Glenveagh were assisted on their journey, and there were emotional scenes when several families left Donegal in 1862 to travel to the other side of the world. By 1937, Glenveagh was bought by Irish-American Henry McElhenney, who had an interest in art, but his plans for Glenveagh were interrupted by the Second World War in 1939. He served in the American Army during the war, so in 1947 he was able to return to Glenveagh and continue his redecoration. He devoted much time restoring the castle and gardens. In 1975, he agreed the sale of Glenveagh Estate to the Office of Public Works, which allowed the creation of a national park. By 1983, he bestowed the castle on Glenveagh National Park to the nation, and it was opened to the public in 1984. The castle opened in 1986, but Mr. McElhenney had died a few months before. While the government are to be lauded for their development of the estate and what is now Glenveagh National Park, and is a tourist attraction visited by people from all over the world, it is very hard not to think of the evictions of time gone by and the lonely ruined houses still standing where they have been never touched since the terrible deed was done. It would be good to have a plaque in the park or to rebuild one of the old houses as an example of how the people lived and a reminder of the terrible devastation and hardship that was caused in Derryveagh about 150 years ago by the evil Black Jack Adair. The ruined houses are still there on the lonely soiled and hillsides where the tears of Derryveagh were shed.